On a Halloween night, beneath a perfectly full moon, an ancient darkness awakened in the small town of Coldwood. No one knew that hidden within the quiet streets and the dense surrounding forest was a curse that had long been forgotten, the curse of the wolf's blood. Elliot Matthews, a young man with a mysterious past and strange dreams, must confront his fate as the full moon rises higher in the sky. In the chase between man and monster, where is the final boundary between reason and instinct, between humanity and savagery? And when the howls echo through the night, will anyone be truly safe? Be warned. What you are about to hear isn't just a story, it's a warning. On a fateful Halloween night, under the light of a blood moon, will you be able to escape the monster within? Halloween had always been the most thrilling time of the year in the small town of Coldwood. Nestled deep within dense forests, the town seemed to drown in darkness every time the sun dipped below the horizon. No one knew exactly how long Coldwood had existed, it had simply always been there. A quiet mystery amid dusty dirt roads and weathered wooden houses. Elliot Matthews had lived his whole life in Coldwood. For him, Halloween wasn't just about costumes or candy. It felt like a mystical dance between darkness and ancient tales. Every year, his grandmother, Mrs. May, would warn him that Halloween wasn't merely a time for fun, it was a night when ancient things could return. But Elliot never took her words seriously. He was 17 now, too old to believe in such childish threats. On a cold day in late October, as the wind whistled through cracks in the window, Elliot climbed up to the attic. He wasn't expecting much, just a bunch of old junk his grandmother had stored away. But this time, hidden among the clutter, he found an old leather-bound book. Its cover was gray and smelled of damp, with the image of a wolf staring back at him, its red eyes glowing like they could pierce right through him. The title read, "The Curse of the Wolf," written in strange, ancient characters. Elliot flipped through the pages, their edges crinkled with age, and found stories of cursed beings who transformed into wolves under the light of the full moon. The pages warned of wolf blood lying dormant in some humans, waiting to awaken. At the end of the book, a faded handwritten note read, "If Halloween falls on the night of a full moon, the cursed one will lose all control." Elliot frowned and glanced over at the calendar hanging on his wall. A chill ran down his spine when he realized that Halloween this year would coincide with a full moon. His heart skipped a beat, but he quickly shrugged it off. "It's just a bunch of nonsense," he muttered, trying to calm himself. That night, just as he was drifting off to sleep, a long, eerie howl echoed from the forest at the edge of town. The sound was hoarse, like it came from the throat of a creature that had been waiting for far too long to be set free. Elliot shut the window, but the unease creeping into his mind refused to leave. The next morning, news spread throughout the town about a large dog found torn to pieces. People whispered about enormous footprints on the dirt road and a strange, rancid smell lingering in the air. At breakfast, Mrs. May stared at Elliot with a grim expression. "I warned you," she muttered, her dark, sunken eyes locked onto him. "Don't go outside on Halloween night. There are things you don't understand." Elliot wanted to laugh it off, but there was something unsettling about her tone, like she was desperately trying to protect him from something she knew far too well. The following night, the howling returned, this time closer, like the creature was slowly making its way into town. Elliot began to feel an unease he couldn't quite explain, as if the fear wasn't just his own but had seeped into every corner of Coldwood. The night wind swept through the wooden slats, carrying the whispers of a terrible secret on the verge of being revealed. Mrs. May locked every door and window, a precaution she had never taken before. The entire town felt suffocated, as though everyone could sense that something dreadful was approaching. Lying in bed, Elliot stared at the ceiling. Wide awake, strange memories began flooding his mind, memories of his parents, who had mysteriously disappeared during a full moon years ago. No one in town ever talked about it, and Mrs. May had never told him anything about what had happened to them. Could his parents have been victims of a creature? Or worse, could they have been part of the curse? Elliot glanced down at his wrist, where a faint scar stretched across his skin. He'd had it for as long as he could remember, always assuming it was from a childhood accident. But now, with everything happening around him, he wasn't so sure anymore. The wind howled through the window cracks, carrying the distant echo of a wolf's howl from deep within the forest. The moon grew fuller with each passing night, as if it were preparing for some grand finale. Elliot squeezed his eyes shut, but he knew sleep would not come. The full moon was nearly upon them, and somehow, he knew that night would change everything. The wind howled over the rooftops of Coldwood as the moon grew brighter each night, as if sharpening its blade, ready to cut through the veil between reality and nightmare. The town was steeped in an unspoken tension. Halloween was just around the corner, and strange occurrences were becoming more frequent. More and more animals were found torn apart, not by ordinary predators, but by something stronger and more savage. Elliot overheard rumors from the adults. A man who lived alone in a cabin by the forest had disappeared 2 nights ago, leaving behind only a long streak of blood that trailed deep into the woods. But no one dared to look for him. The police barely jotted a few notes in their books before shaking their heads. No one wanted to get involved with a mystery like this. "It'll blow over," someone whispered at the diner. But everyone knew something was moving in the shadows, and it was creeping closer by the second. The next night, Elliot lay awake in bed, trying to convince himself that everything was just a string of strange coincidences. But the nightmare had already begun. He was pulled into a strange dream. In it, he stood naked in the forest behind town, bathed in the glow of the full moon. His skin itched and burned. When he looked down at his hands, he saw sharp claws where his fingers should have been. His breath came out in puffs of cold mist, thick with the metallic scent of blood. He ran through the woods, feeling a primal thrill surge through his veins, a wild, maddening joy. Then he heard something, a panting sound. When he looked down, he found himself gnawing at the throat of a small animal. Its fur clung to his lips, and the sound of bones cracking echoed in his jaws. Elliot laughed, a dry, guttural sound, as the moonlight above blazed brighter, swallowing the forest in a lunatic brilliance. He jolted awake, drenched in sweat, gasping for breath like the air had been sucked from his lungs. His wrist burned, and when he looked down, he saw that the old scar had torn open, dripping fresh blood. But worse than the wound was the feeling inside him, a distant, insistent call, urging him to surrender to something lurking deep within. The next morning, Elliot met Mary Ann at the school gates. Mary Ann was the only person in town who didn't believe in superstitions. "I swear, everyone in Coldwood is nuts," she said, chewing her gum with a shrug. But when Elliot told her about the ancient book and his unsettling dream, her confidence faltered. She studied him carefully, searching for any sign that he was joking. But Elliot's eyes didn't lie. They were filled with an undeniable fear. Raw and chilling. "I heard howling from the forest, Mary Ann," Elliot whispered, his voice rough. "There's something out there, and it's coming." Mary Ann bit her lip. "So, what? You think you're gonna turn into a werewolf and rip me apart on Halloween night?" she joked. But the nervous edge in her laugh betrayed her fear. "Maybe," Elliot said quietly, his voice barely audible. That evening, Mrs. May locked the doors earlier than usual. Elliot sat by the window, watching the crescent moon rise into the sky. His grandmother moved silently around the house, checking every lock and drawing every curtain. The air inside was heavy with fear and hidden truths, like a storm waiting to explode. When Mrs. May finally went to bed, Elliot slipped out of the house, ignoring her warnings. The cold night air stung his skin like tiny needles, and his footsteps echoed through the narrow alleyways, each step sounding like a distant knock from the unknown. Mary Ann was waiting for him at the end of the street. Together, they decided to head toward the forest where the howls had echoed the night before. They walked in silence, as if speaking would make their fears come true. The forest loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. The tall trees stood like ancient sentinels, bearing silent witness to every crime committed beneath their branches. As they ventured deeper into the woods, Elliot began to hear strange noises. The dry leaves rustled, as if something slithered beneath their feet. And then they saw it, a trail of blood, dragged across the decaying leaves, leading deeper into the shadows. Mary Ann took a step back, her voice cracking. "We should go back." But Elliot couldn't turn back. Something within the forest was calling to him, like it had been waiting for him all along. They took a few more steps and found the body of the missing man. He lay on his back, eyes wide and lifeless, his chest ripped open as if by a monstrous beast. But what froze Elliot in place were the claw marks on the corpse, marks identical to the scar on his wrist. Mary Ann screamed, but her cry was drowned out by a howl that echoed from within the forest. It was unlike any sound from a living creature, a howl that belonged to something far more sinister. Elliot turned to Mary Ann, and in the faint moonlight, she saw something terrifying in his eyes, a wild, feral gleam that no longer belonged to a human. His teeth had grown longer, and his nails sharpened into claws. "Run," Elliot whispered, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please, just run." Mary Ann stood frozen for a moment, her eyes wide with terror. Then, as instinct took over, she turned and bolted into the darkness. Sprinting toward the safety of town, Elliot collapsed to his knees, his trembling hands clawing at the dry leaves beneath him. And in that moment, he understood. The curse had already begun. Time was running out. Tomorrow night, under the full moon, he would no longer be himself. Night fell, and Halloween had arrived. Darkness blanketed the town of Coldwood like a thick shroud, covering everything. The streets buzzed with laughter, the patter of children's feet echoing as they dashed about in strange costumes. Jack-o'-lanterns glowed on doorsteps, and the air was thick with the smell of candy, caramel apples, and something else, a sharp scent of mist, blood, and damp flesh. The full moon, large and red as a devil's eye, had begun to rise over the horizon. Elliot stood by the window, looking down at the crowds outside. He felt like a caged animal on the verge of breaking free. His hands trembled as he scratched at the wooden window frame, and he realized with a jolt that his nails were growing long, sharp, and curved like claws. Cold sweat dripped down his face, and his breath came in quick, shallow bursts, like a hunting dog straining at its leash. In the dim light of the living room, Mrs. May sat in her rocking chair, her sunken eyes filled with guilt and sorrow as she stared at Elliot. "I tried," she whispered, "but in the end, the wolf's blood in our family always finds a way." "You knew all along," Elliot hissed through gritted teeth, anger simmering beneath his words. "You knew I'd become this, just like my parents?" Mrs. May lowered her head in silence, and that was all the answer Elliot needed. His parents hadn't abandoned him like the town said. They died, consumed by the curse in their blood, transformed into monsters. His grandmother must have stopped them somehow, maybe even killed them to prevent the curse from spreading. But with Elliot, she had failed. "I tried to protect you," Mrs. May murmured, clutching the silver cross around her neck. "But tonight, there's nothing more I can do." A searing heat spread through Elliot's body, as though fire was burning under his skin. His flesh twitched and convulsed, as if something monstrous inside him was clawing its way to the surface, ready to tear through his fragile human form. "You have to lock me up," Elliot gasped. "Tie me down before it happens." But Mrs. May shook her head, tears sliding down her wrinkled cheeks. "It won't hold. The moment moonlight touches you, it'll take over." The blood-red moon now hung high in the sky, its light streaming through the window and onto Elliot. The change hit him like a wave. His bones cracked and twisted, reshaping themselves painfully. Thousands of needle-like stabs tore through his muscles. He collapsed onto the floor, mouth open in a silent scream that turned into a guttural growl, the sound of a beast awakening. Mrs. May rose slowly, holding a gleaming silver dagger in her trembling hand. "I can't let you hurt anyone, Elliot," she whispered. "There's only one way." But Elliot, no. The thing becoming Elliot, moved faster than she expected. His claws slashed through the air, sinking into her arm. With a fierce shove, he flung her across the room. She cried out in pain, blood spilling from the deep gash. Elliot stood, no longer fully human. Dark gray fur sprouted across his chest and arms, and sharp fangs jutted from his mouth. Hunger, terrible, insatiable hunger, clouded his mind, burning away the last fragments of his humanity. He stared down at his grandmother, the only person who had ever loved and protected him, but all he could feel now was the overwhelming craving for blood. He lunged at her, but before he could strike, a pounding at the door froze him in place. "Elliot, Elliot, are you in there?" It was Mary Ann's voice. Elliot hesitated. Somewhere deep in his mind, a tiny spark of humanity flickered, but it was fleeting. The moment Mary Ann pushed open the door, the blood-red moonlight poured over him again, and the beast roared. Mary Ann froze in the doorway, staring in horror. What stood before her was no longer Elliot, but a towering, fur-covered monster, snarling with sharp claws and bloodthirsty fangs. "Run!" Elliot growled, his voice distorted and desperate, fighting against the monster within. But it was too late. The beast had taken over. It lunged toward Mary Ann, driven by a hunger too powerful to resist. Mary Ann screamed and spun on her heel, sprinting into the night. Elliot's claws tore into the wooden floor as he burst out of the house, chasing her through the dark streets. Outside, the Halloween festivities continued, unaware of the real monster that had slipped into their midst. Elliot barreled past children dressed as witches and ghosts, blending into the shadows like a living nightmare. Mary Ann ran as fast as she could, but Elliot was faster. His hot breath huffed against the back of her neck, and she knew he would catch her any second now. With no other option, Mary Ann veered off the road and plunged into the forest. They tore through the dense woods, branches slapping against their faces as they ran deeper into the night. Elliot could feel his last shred of control slipping away. His claws ripped into tree trunks, his jaws snapping with feral growls. He was no longer Elliot, he was a wild animal, a wolf driven by instinct and bloodlust. Mary Ann stumbled and tumbled down a small hill, landing breathless among a pile of dead leaves. When she looked up, Elliot was already there, looming over her, saliva dripping from his fangs. His eyes, glowing red under the cursed moon, locked onto hers. "Elliot," she whispered, hoping, begging, that some part of her friend was still in there. But there was nothing left. Elliot raised his claw, ready to deliver the final blow. The moonlight bathed him in an eerie, crimson glow, and in that fleeting moment, Elliot looked into Mary Ann's eyes, and something inside him snapped. He roared, not with triumph, but with agony and despair. Staggering back, he fought the monster within him, thrashing against the curse that consumed him. Mary Ann scrambled away, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched in disbelief. Then, with a final, tortured growl, Elliot turned and sprinted deeper into the forest, leaving everything behind, his friend, the town of Coldwood, and the last remnants of his humanity. The beast had won, but at least, for now, the people he cared about were safe. Deep within the ancient forest, where darkness clung like damp silk, Elliot ran, whether he was fleeing or hunting. Even he couldn't tell. His sharp teeth clenched tight. His powerful legs pounded the ground, and each step seemed to hammer in the final nails of his humanity. Dry leaves and brittle branches crumbled under his claws, and his heart thundered in his chest like a relentless drumbeat, merging with the growls rising from deep within his throat. Mary Ann was still alive. He didn't know how he had stopped himself, but somehow, when he looked into her eyes, a flicker of clarity had broken through the chaos, if only for a moment. Then he ran, as far away as he could, because he knew that if he stayed, the hunger inside him would win again, and next time, no one would survive. Above him, the full moon hung in the sky like a cold, indifferent eye, illuminating the forest with its crimson light. Elliot barreled through the woods, ducking between rotting trunks and sinking deeper into the wilds, where even moonlight couldn't penetrate. All around him, there was only darkness, the wind howling through the trees, and the burning hunger gnawing at his very being. He stumbled into a hollow, his head spinning in a feverish blur of beast and man. Elliot roared in agony as his body continued to shift, bones cracking, muscles twisting beneath his skin with every violent convulsion, crushing what little humanity remained within him. In a haze, Elliot saw fleeting images of his parents, two monstrous creatures howling under the full moon before being hunted down and killed. He heard gunshots, screams, and the dying howls of beings that had once been human. His grandmother had done everything she could to hide the truth, but the wolf's blood had never left. It had only waited for the right time to return. The sound of rustling leaves behind him snapped Elliot out of his daze. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was Mary Ann. She had come back for him, for reasons even she didn't fully understand. Maybe she couldn't believe her friend was completely gone. Or maybe, deep down, she knew that if she left Elliot alone in the woods, the monster inside him would consume him whole. "Elliot," she called, her voice trembling. Elliot turned to face her, but his eyes no longer glowed with the mindless rage of a beast. There was something else in them, fear, a silent plea for help, as though Elliot was still trapped somewhere beneath the fur. Fangs, And claws. Mary Ann stepped closer, cautiously and slowly. The darkness pressed down like a heavy blanket, muffling every sound except the whisper of the wind and the crunch of leaves beneath her feet. Elliot shivered violently, as though he was a spring wound too tight, ready to snap at any moment. "You have to fight it," she whispered, her voice desperate. "You're Elliot. You're still in there. I know you are." He couldn't speak, but in that moment of agony, Elliot felt the crushing weight of an awful truth. There was no escape from the curse. Fighting it was pointless. The wolf's blood consumed everyone who carried it, sooner or later. And once it did, he would forget who he was. He would become nothing more than a creature, hunting and killing everything in his path. Elliot looked at Mary Ann with deep sorrow. "Run," he whispered, barely able to force the words out. "This time, I can't hold on much longer." But Mary Ann didn't run. Instead, she raised something small, the silver dagger from Mrs. May, the one she had grabbed before chasing after Elliot. "I won't let you become a monster," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I won't lose you." Elliot roared, not the roar of a predator, but the anguished cry of someone who knew everything was lost. He lunged toward Mary Ann, not to kill her, but because he knew she had to act before it was too late. With a scream of pain and desperation, Mary Ann drove the silver blade deep into Elliot's chest. He froze mid-lunge, the growl in his throat dying out. The blood-red moonlight bathed his face, half human, half wolf, and for a fleeting moment, Mary Ann saw a glimmer of Elliot within those crimson eyes. He smiled, just a small, grateful smile. Then Elliot collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing one final time before going still. Mary Ann knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she clutched the blood-stained dagger. The forest fell silent, and the cold moonlight illuminated the grim scene. There were no more howls, no more sounds, only the ragged sobs of Mary Ann. She looked down at Elliot, now fully human again. No fur, no claws, just a boy, his face peaceful at last, as though he had finally found freedom. Mary Ann buried her face in his chest, her sobs echoing through the stillness of the ancient forest. Months passed, and life in Coldwood seemed to return to normal. No one spoke of what had happened, but for Mary Ann, nothing would ever be the same. She knew the wolf's blood still existed, maybe not in Elliot anymore, but somewhere out there, it still flowed through others. The curse never ended, it only waited for the right time to return. And on another full moon night, it would find its next victim. On that night, Elliot Matthews vanished forever, not because some monster out there had killed him, but because he had become the very monster he once feared. The moon remained full, its light shining down on the ancient forest where Mary Ann sat silently beside her friend's lifeless body, knowing she had set him free, though the price was an emptiness that could never be filled. But the curse isn't over. It only sleeps, lurking in the shadows, waiting. And on another full moon night, someone, maybe a friend, a loved one, or even you, will feel something stirring deep within their blood. Because, you see, in the darkness of forests and the chill of winter winds, the wolf's blood never disappears. It only waits.